Welcome to this virtual Commonwealth Club program, Reducing Nuclear Weapons, Stopping the War No One Wants. I'm Frederick Barron from the Cooley Law Firm, proudly supporting this program. During this extraordinary period, the Commonwealth Club in the Bay Area is conducting a series of virtual programs. You can learn about these offerings at the commonwealthclub.org website, where you can also donate to support the club's programming. Audience members today can submit questions to the panel using the text chat feature, and please share and like the program on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. From Cooley's vantage point on the immense promise of Silicon Valley's own globalization, it's sobering to witness the globalization of a novel virus, and even more so, the globalization of nuclear weapons proliferation. In nuclear arms control, as in epidemiology, we ignore global interdependence at our global mortal peril. The following are high on the punch list to be addressed today. In the past 2 years, the US formally withdrew from the Reagan-Gorbachev Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces INF Treaty on ground-launched missiles. Russia then followed suit, withdrawing. China, a nuclear superpower, is not actively participating in nuclear negotiations. On the Korean Peninsula and in the Middle East, nuclear threats persist. Major nations, however, have failed to reach consensus or take concerted action to address these pressing threats and others. Two crucial inflection points are looming now. First, a bilateral agreement with Russia must be negotiated to extend the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, New START, before it expires early next year. Second, the 50-year-old Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, NPT, must be renewed. 191 nations are parties to the NPT, which is the cornerstone of the global non-proliferation and verification regime. Its future is at stake now. It is imperative to harness the upcoming NPT process to chart an international path away from nuclear anarchy and toward cooperation and weaponry wind down. If anyone can point the way through this thicket, it's the distinguished panel assembled here today by the Commonwealth Club. They personify the seasoned judgment that must be brought to bear on nuclear weapons reduction, lest we eventually conquer a confounding virus, only to find ourselves staring at a nuclear launch threat. It's my pleasure to turn the program over to our moderator, Dr. Gloria Duffy, the Commonwealth Club's president and CEO. Gloria served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense under Defense Secretary William Perry in the Clinton administration, and she negotiated agreements decommissioning weapons of mass destruction in the former Soviet states. Dr. Duffy will introduce you in greater depth to the remarkable panelists assembled for this forum.
Thank you so much, Mr. Barron, and welcome everyone. I'm going to briefly introduce our distinguished panelists, and then I'll ask each of them a question to get our discussion rolling. George Shultz served as Secretary of State under President Ronald Reagan. In his additional roles as Secretary of the Treasury and Secretary of Labor, he has aided presidents, confronted national and international crises, and argued passionately that the United States has a vital stake in promoting democratic values and institutions. Currently, he's a distinguished fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and he's coming to us today from Stanford. Dr. William Perry, a Silicon Valley entrepreneur, was Secretary of Defense under President Bill Clinton. He's Professor Emeritus at Stanford University and a Senior Fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. As Secretary of Defense, Dr. Perry galvanized efforts to secure nuclear stockpiles inherited by former Soviet states and presided over the dismantlement of more than 8,000 nuclear weapons. And he's also my former boss. He is coming to us today from Palo Alto, California. Rose Gottemoeller recently retired as Deputy Secretary General of NATO and also served as Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security at the US State Department under President Obama. She was the chief negotiator for the most recent Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, commonly referred to as New START. She is coming to us, I believe, from Mountain View, California. Izumi Nakamitsu has served as United Nations Undersecretary General of Disarmament Affairs since 2017. She also served as the director of the Asia and Middle East Division of the United Nations Department of Peacekeeping Operations. I presume she's coming to us from New York today. And Edmund G. Jerry Brown served 4 terms as California's governor, in addition to serving as the state's attorney general and as mayor of Oakland, California. He has long worked to increase dialogue and reduce international tensions, especially those between the US and Russia. And I presume you're coming to us from Colusa, California. I'm going to begin by asking each panelist in turn for their perspective on the current nuclear threat. So let's start with you, Secretary Shultz. Could you please frame the issues as you see them that we're talking about today?
Well, first of all, I note that the Bulletin of Atomic Sciences, which is a group of scientists started after the Manhattan Project, so these are businesses who know what they're talking about. I think, Jerry Brown, you're now a part of this operation, but they have what they call a doomsday clock. It's now set just before midnight, the closest ever been to midnight. Why? Because the powers who have nuclear weapons are perfecting them and working on them and proliferating. You have wild cards around like North Korea. You have disputes between, let's say, India and Pakistan, where a conventional war could easily morph into a nuclear war. You have all kinds of possibilities with the use of nuclear weapons. So that's a big problem. What to do? Well, I think, first of all, we've got to dust off Rose Gottemiller again and have her do New START and get it. She's wisely put into it a provision that allows it to be extended for another 5 years. And oddly, the Russians have publicly stated they're glad to do that. So what's the matter with us? Let's get our own government going and do that. And in the process, there ought to be a discussion between Russia and the United States about that. And maybe that can broaden itself out to a bigger discussion. And maybe China could be invited to join. So those things that could be done. And I think it would be wonderful to have them done. Now, Bill Perry and Sam Nunn and I, not too long ago, wrote a piece suggesting that the Congress appoint a high-level observer group, as we had in the 1980s. Let's have some big shots from Congress get together and work with the administration to help develop views on this. They could go to sessions and listen and be part of it. So on the one hand, they could contribute their ideas. And on the other hand, when people come back with an agreement, it would be relatively easy to get it ratified. That happened in the 80s, and it was very useful. So those are things that we should do to get things going. But the key is to take advantage of the fact that there is a 5-year extension looming. Russia has said it's ready to go ahead with that. And let's go, United States, get going. It's up to us.
Thank you, Secretary Shultz. Let's turn now to Secretary Perry. Could you tell us your views about new technologies, new defense and strategic technologies, and their impact on strategic stability?
Situation that George described is sort of fundamentally unstable. In summing up, I believe the same point that he made, that the probability of a nuclear catastrophe today is actually greater than it was during the Cold War. This could happen not by calculated attack by the US on Russia or by Russia on the US, but by an accident or by miscalculation. That has happened before. We've had accidents, false alarms. I myself personally experienced 2 false alarms, one of which came very close to waking the president and asking him to make a decision to launch. It could happen by miscalculation, of which the Cuban Missile Crisis is the poster child. This likelihood is not maybe 1 in 100, it's certainly remote, but even 1 in 100 is odds when you consider the outcome is a catastrophic end of civilization. Those odds are too high, and we ought to do everything we can to lower them. How does technology come into this? Unfortunately, technology actually aggravates the problem rather than eases it. The technology, for example, cyber technology, opened up the possibility that our command link, ordering a nuclear weapon, could somehow be interfered with. You could take some malignant source that would deliberately want to stimulate a false launch, or if we wanted to launch, if we had a legitimate launch command, it could find a way of stopping us. So the technology in this case actually makes the problem worse and not better. What can we do to actually lower this danger? The things we can do are more political than they are technology. We could end the sole authority of the president to launch nuclear weapons as it stands now. Only one person can make that decision, and no one can stop him if he decides to launch it. We can end the launch on warning policy that we have today, and we can begin to phase out those nuclear weapons that are especially susceptible to false alarm. So the issue is, how do we reduce the likelihood of blundering into nuclear war through a miscalculation or through an accident? And unfortunately, technology doesn't add to that problem, it only aggravates the problem.
Thank you so much, Dr. Perry. Let's turn to Undersecretary Nakamitsu. Could you tell us about the status of the Non-Proliferation Treaty?
Thank you, Dr. Duffy. So we've heard about the growing dangers posed by nuclear weapons and the factors that are precipitating the increasing possibility of their use. Suffice to say, I guess, the potential for the use of nuclear weapons is higher than it has been since the darkest days of the Cold War. I think the real problem is that there is a clear absence of trust, diminishing transparency, and also resulting as a result of reliance on military instead of diplomatic solutions. It is an evolving and, I would say, very fluid environment in which the dangers of miscalculations are really magnified. So it requires an urgent return to dialogue, agreement on transparency and confidence building measures, and proper consideration of not only how to preserve the great gains already made, but also to pursue disarmament, non-proliferation, and arms control in a changed environment. And I want to emphasize here that we at the United Nations see disarmament, non-proliferation, and arms control as important tools for security, and not as an idealistic or utopian philosophy, if you will. And I would argue that historically, there used to be that understanding between the superpowers even during the Cold War. At the multilateral level, I believe that the NPT, with its review cycle, remains the best mechanism to facilitate the achievement of these goals. And as I have said on so many occasions, the NPT is a pillar of international security for 3 reasons. Number 1, it contains verifiable non-proliferation obligations. Number 2, they are legally binding disarmament commitments. And number 3, its near universal membership means that these commitments and obligations are assumed by the vast majority of the international community. And I think the diversity of membership, including most of the developing world, is important because a nuclear war would have global consequences, as we all know. In this context, while arms control agreements may be of limited membership, they are of value to the entire international community. And likewise, all states have a responsibility to pursue the elimination of nuclear weapons. And while multilateral approaches to disarmament are not the only path to take, their inclusivity helps to create a strong global norms, which is also quite a key. As many of you know, the 10th NPT Review Conference has been postponed due to the COVID-19 crisis, but it will be held, and the states parties and other stakeholders should really use this hiatus as an opportunity to lay the ground for success. And I think there are several ways in which states parties can use the review conference to reduce the growing danger of nuclear weapon use and get us back on the path to a world free of nuclear weapons. And let me just suggest very quickly 5. First, they can reaffirm their commitment, hopefully at the high level, to the NPT and all commitments they have assumed as parties. And second, they can return to the logic of President Reagan and General Secretary Gorbachev by collectively recognizing that a nuclear war cannot be won and must not be fought. Third, they can agree on risk reduction measures and confidence building mechanisms, including on verification and compliance. Fourth, they can agree that challenges to the non-proliferation regime are not static, and therefore the regime cannot be either. It really needs to be adapted to the evolving threats of this century. And then fifth, therefore, the review conference should be a springboard for dialogue on how to think about disarmament, non-proliferation, and arms control in today's geostrategic conditions as well. So an obvious development that would can certainly help success at the review conference will be the extension of the New START in order to avoid both the dangerous situation of unconstrained nuclear competition and also to buy time for further negotiations. And it would also be a demonstration, I would like to suggest, of the United States and the Russian Federation's implementation of their Article 6 commitments. So in concluding, the pandemic, I think, is teaching all of us that international crisis can only be resolved through solidarity, compassion, and strong institutions. And I think these are the lessons that can translate also to the challenges of international peace and security, and especially to nuclear weapons. And I hope these are the lessons that we are all learning. Thank you.
Thank you, Undersecretary Nakamitsu. Turning to my good friend, former Deputy Secretary Gottemoeller, could you talk about the New START Treaty? What could be next, extending it, European views on these issues?
Very good, and thank you, Gloria, for this opportunity to join such a distinguished group, but also to speak to the Commonwealth Club members and your wider audience. I would like to pick up on what George Shultz and also Izumi Nakamitsu had to say about the New START Treaty, focusing first on its contribution to our national security as well as to global peace and stability. When the first START Treaty entered into force in 1994, the United States and Russia each deployed approximately 12,000 strategic nuclear warheads. START cut those numbers in half to about 6,000 on each side. The Moscow Treaty of 2002 cut the numbers further to about 2,200 on each side. The New START Treaty has now reduced the number of strategic warheads deployed by the US and Russia to 1,550. From 12,000 warheads in 1994 to 1,550 in 2020. That is an enormous success for nuclear disarmament, but it has also benefited our national security, ensuring that we are not facing an unpredictable nuclear opponent, nor a destabilizing nuclear arms race. Indeed, this nuclear stability has benefited the world as a whole. But we still have work to do. Those warhead numbers should be further reduced, and additional global players such as China also need to be involved in the process. But for negotiators to succeed, we need a stable and predictable basis on which to talk. That is why extension of the New START Treaty is so important. According to the terms of the treaty, it may be extended for 5 years beyond February 2021, so pretty easy to do, no further negotiation required. And as Secretary Shultz said, the Russians have already said they're ready to go. Otherwise, the treaty will expire. That 5 years, if the treaty is extended, will give us the opportunity to negotiate further nuclear reductions below the 1,550 warheads and constrain new and dangerous nuclear weapon systems. It also gives us the time to work with new players and bring them into the process, the Chinese, but possibly other players as well. Without those 5 years and without the treaty, I fear a rapid deterioration in our security environment. The Russians have a lot of warheads in storage, and they could quickly break out of the constraints of the New START treaty if it goes away, uploading additional warheads, perhaps several hundred, on their already existing missiles. They wouldn't need to buy or build any more missiles. They could simply put more warheads on them. So we need to ask ourselves, do we want to face more Russian nuclear weapons, or would we prefer to keep reducing them? That is the stark choice before us, the United States of America, but also it is one that concerns the international community as well. One final word. I want to stress that the NATO allies are strong supporters of the extension of New START. They are very articulate on this score, from the top political leaders in the alliance on down. They will continue to urge the extension of the New START treaty as a vital facet of European security, as well as global security. Again, thank you for this opportunity. I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Rose. Turning to you, Governor Brown, what is the importance of dialogue? What do leaders need to do to reduce the nuclear threat?
It's never been less or more shallow than it is today. The weaponry, as Bill Perry suggested, is in a dangerous state. The chance of a blunder or accident, false alert, rising. And yet, in the face of all that, Russians and Americans are talking less. So what we're facing here, in the absence of dialogue, is a rising danger with less pathways of communication that are used and operate in a way that if there's some crisis, U.S. and Russia could talk to one another. We know from the virus, the coronavirus, that just came out of the blue. I mean, there were people predicting a pandemic, but it certainly was a surprise, hard for people to believe. Well, a surprise could happen in nuclear weapon systems as well. And yet it's hard to get on the alert for what doesn't exist yet. And that's where we are. We haven't had any nuclear explosions since Nagasaki. And that's what makes it particularly difficult. Now, if you look back at starting with one partner here, the US, if you go to Congress, there's very little interest in nuclear weaponry. There's even less interest in dialogue with Russia. Russia is now being stigmatized in a way that makes dialogue more and more less plausible and less politically attractive. If you speak with members and leaders in Congress, as I have, you will find very quickly that the matters that we're talking about today are of little interest. This is not on the agenda. If you look in the media, the news of the day is what is prevailing, and that news of the day does not involve nuclear risk. The movement of the doomsday clock closer to doomsday, to the wipeout possibly of civilization, that was not deemed news by the New York Times and other major outlets. It wasn't some. So we have a major challenge here just in waking up people to what is and what the dangers before us. So I would say we have to find a way for prominent people to bring back into the mainstream discussions domestically about nuclear weaponry, and also the plausibility, the righteousness of dialogue with Russia, with adversaries. And there's too much thinking, mistaken thinking, that you punish people by not talking. It's just the opposite. When there's danger and when there's things we don't like about Russia, it's time to talk. And there's now an environment that I see, and I've watched the political scene for well over 50 years. It's highly unusual, the blaming. It's a blame game, not a inquiry game. And we're not in the inquiry, what do we need to do? What should we do? So on this very important issue, it's not on the agenda, and we've got to get it back on the agenda. You got to wake up Congress. And yes, a committee such as George Shultz suggested makes a lot of sense. But so far, I'd say the ears are plugged, and we have to open up the listing of prominent people to get what we're talking about today even on the agenda. In fact, I would say this meeting is perhaps even subversive of the status quo and the conventional thinking, because it's not about weapon systems. New START is just getting on the agenda the last few months. We need to accelerate first the focus, and then the conversation, and then the dialogue. You do all that, we got a fighting chance.
Thank you, Secretary Brown. And let's hope that this program is a start and we'll get this discussion around as broadly as we can. I believe Secretary Shultz
By the
had
way,
a comment.
I was a secretary once when I was Secretary of State. Now I'm emeritus.
Governor Brown. Secretary Shultz, did you have a comment?
Well, you mentioned personal things. So let me tell you the story of President Reagan. When we took office, the relationship between the US and the Soviet Union could not have been worse. When they invaded Afghanistan, President Jimmy Carter cut off all relations, no athletes to the Olympics, no talks of any kind, zero. And I had run the US-Soviet economic relationship when I was Secretary of Treasury, and I felt this was very uncomfortable, particularly with the nuclear things. And I discovered in my private conversations with President Reagan that he thought nuclear weapons were immoral. And so I worked to start, I tried to get permission to have Ambassador Dobrynin come to see me once a week, and we would find weeds in the relationship and get them out before they grew. So that was set up. And one time I was returning from a trip to China, and it was very bad weather. I was lucky to land. Snowed all day Friday, snowed Friday night, snowed Saturday. Our phone rings, and Nancy Reagan says, "Why don't you bring your wife and come over and have supper with us at the White House?" So we go over there, and they start asking me about the Chinese leaders. What are they like? They have a sense of humor. Can you find their bottom line? And then he knew I did, well, the Soviets, so he started asking me about them. And I'm sitting there, and it's dawning on me, this man has never had a real conversation with a big-time communist leader. He's dying to have one. So I said, "Mr. President, Dobrynin is coming over next Tuesday at 5. What if I bring him over here and you can talk to him?" He said, "That's a great idea. It'll only take about 10 minutes. All I want to tell him is, if his new leader, Andropov, it wants to have a constructive conversation, I'm ready." Wow, that was a blockbuster. In other words, you got to have a leader who's willing to lead and do what he thinks is right, and then people will follow him. And that's what we had with President Reagan. So Dobrynin came over, we were there at least an hour and a half, talked a lot about Soviet Jewry. It was impressive because he had names and places and incidents, but it's just general stuff. We talked about Palestinians who rushed into our embassy and they were still there. And of course, we talked about nuclear weapons. And so on the way back to the State Department, Dobrynin and I agreed, let's do something about the Pentecostals, see if we can get that resolved. So we exchanged pieces of paper back and forth. And finally, I got one that I thought was pretty good. So I took it over to the president. I said, "Mr. President, please don't call your lawyer. He'll tell you there are too many holes in this memo. But I think with all the background, if we get them to come out of the embassy, they will be allowed to go home and eventually emigrate." So we rolled the dice and we did that. And they were allowed to go home and they were allowed to emigrate. But not just them, all their families, 50 or 60 people. It was a giant event. And the press was all wondering, well, how did this happen? Reagan never said a word. And I thought that this was a little element, you mentioned trust early on, of trust, because he saw you could make a deal with these people and they would carry it out. They saw the same thing. They knew how tempting it was for an American politician to say, look what I did. And he said he wouldn't say anything if he didn't. So you can trust him. Earlier, somebody said something about trust is the coin of the realm. That's right. And I think that's the kind of personal relationship somehow ought to be brought about.
All of you have talked about steps we need to take, but at this time, we're sort of seeing a backsliding in most of these areas. The US has pulled out of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement, charging the Russians with cheating. New START may be about to expire. The Iran agreement has gone by the wayside. Now there's a rumor that the president is going to withdraw from the Open Skies Treaty. So what do you see in terms of the actual trends, and how does change occur? Is there a philosophy in this administration in the US? How can that be changed? How can the leadership you're talking about come to fruition?
I think it'd be very helpful if we could get someone like Mitch McConnell or some of the people on the Republican side of the U.S. Senate talking to the president. So, yes, talk to the president through people whom he respects, but also try to win over some of the senators. I don't think they understand what a nuclear weapon can do, or if they know theoretically, they haven't really engaged it in a realistic way. What do these weapons mean? I think they have their head in their sand, head in the sand. They're not thinking about it. So somebody's got to wake up the leadership. You start with the president, you get the president's assistant, or you get some of the senators. We have to talk about it. I went with Bill Perry and Sam Nunn, and we talked to some of these leaders. And some of them couldn't even talk about it for more than 2 minutes before getting off to another topic. So I think the first step is to educate the people as close to the president as possible, to the danger that is before us, and the obvious next step of Open Skies, staying in it, and the New START. Those are the product. But before you can get there, you have to get some allies in powerful positions. Maybe it's people in the private sector. Somebody has got to bring this topic before the president and some of the leaders of the Senate on the Republican side, also on the Democratic side. From what I've said, and I've talked to many of them, this is of no interest. There's a few that are worried about New START in the House, maybe a couple in the Senate, but nowhere near what it takes to create the consensus or the mood that would move a president in the way that we're talking about today.
This is one reason why Bill and Sam and I advocated having the Congress appoint a high-level observer group that would represent congressional interest in this whole matter.
Could so the Open Skies Treaty is the next one, potentially on the chopping block. Could anyone explain what the Open Skies Treaty is and what its importance is? It's probably the first of the treaties of the modern nuclear arms control era.
Well, perhaps I'll make a start, Gloria. The Open Skies Treaty was actually an idea of President Eisenhower to begin with, so it has deep historical roots. And he believed greatly that if we could have, and this was in the early post-World War II era, so still in the 1950s, but if we could have some predictability and transparency with regard to conventional forces, that would help to sustain and maintain peace over time. And the idea is that, just as the treaty says, open skies, both all parties basically, and there are many signatories among the US allies in Europe, but also partners like Sweden and Finland, who are not NATO allies, are members of the Open Skies Treaty. And we fly over the territory of the Russian Federation and some other territories in what we call the former Soviet space. But the Russian Federation has been the most flown over in terms of having aircraft flights by allies and partners on aircraft that are run by, again, various partners. The United States has a fleet of aircraft, but so do the Norwegians, the Germans, etc. and the Swedes, and we are able to take pictures of Russian military facilities and what is going on inside the Russian military establishment. They can do the same to us. They come and fly over the United States, and they fly over Europe. It's been extraordinarily valuable to NATO allies because many of them don't have big overhead satellites. They don't have expensive intelligence gathering gear. But the photos that come off of the Open Skies aircraft are available to all, and they can use them again to develop their own analyses of what's going on and enhance mutual confidence and predictability. They've also been a great tool in the period since Russia illegally seized the Crimea, and the NATO allies have used the flights from the Open Skies Treaty to signal to the Russians that they are headed down the wrong path. For example, with their seizure of Ukrainian naval vessels in the Kerch Straits in November of 2018. So it has multiple applications, but it's been extraordinarily valuable and is highly regarded by US allies and partners in Europe as something very valuable for their security.
So I might ask Dr. Perry to talk a bit about this. I know your field in business was partly in surveillance, in the surveillance field. So what do you see as the importance of this agreement? And I believe you and Senator Nunn and Mr. Schultz have come out or about to come out begging the president essentially to stay in the Open Skies Treaty.
I think there are two different ways of looking at the Open Sky Treaty and all of the treaties, as a matter of fact. Aside from the substantive value of being able to look into what's going on in Russia today, which was very important back in the days when Eisenhower negotiated this treaty, not so important today because of our satellite systems. But in addition to that, we have the dialogue that goes on in administrating the treaty. We have Russians and Americans talking with each other on issues of mutual importance. That's also true of our arms control treaties, which provide for the discussion between Americans and Russians. Aside from that, we have no dialogue today. We have nothing going on between US and Russia, talking about nuclear dangers, talking about nuclear issues. That is a catastrophe in and of itself. So these treaties are the last vehicles we have for dialogue. It shouldn't be that way, but that's the way it is. So I'm strongly supportive of the treaties for that reason alone, quite aside from the objective benefits of them.
So moving to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, another treaty whose future is up in the air at the moment. Could you tell us a little bit, Undersecretary Nakamitsu, about the process for reviewing the treaty, the importance of the treaty, when you expect the review conference to take place, what you expect to come out of it?
Yeah, so the NPT, as I always say, this is absolutely one of the most important cornerstones of international peace and security. So it is absolutely important that the next review conference, the 10th ones, whenever it would take place, it's not exactly certain. We have a tentative date, but obviously it will depend on the COVID-19 situation. Let's hope that it will take place as soon as it is possible. It will be very important to have a good outcome from this review conference. But let me say very clearly that even if we don't have a comprehensive outcome document adopted, I don't think it will actually completely result in the collapse of a NPT treaty. It is a very resilient treaty, precisely because all states parties, including the P5, the nuclear weapons states, they recognize the value of that treaty as a pillar of international security. So we need to remember that there is no template, if you will. This is what we really need to achieve as an outcome document. There is no template. What we need in the current geopolitical tensions, at the international level, we need to be very creative in terms of how we come up with a good outcome. which can be accepted by all states parties. Now, obviously, it will require political leadership. And I would argue, I always say that everyone, all states parties, including nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states, have a responsibility vis-a-vis the treaty. It is important that everyone demonstrates the full implementation of past commitments. But I think taking advantage of the treaty's 50th anniversary of enter into force as a momentum will hopefully help states parties to come up with a reasonably good outcome. And that's why I've been suggesting those 5 issues as potential key elements. One good news is that even with the COVID-19 crisis and the physical meetings have not been possible, states parties actually are having very active consultations. The president-designate has been extremely active in pulling together those states parties and conducting good consultation processes. So let us hope that there will be a political momentum towards a successful review conference.
And talking with Sylvia, a scientist, person that works with me as part of it, that's how I know about it. Maybe he would say a word about that because it's a very encouraging development.
Let me just note, we have with us Professor Raymond Jeanlot, who's a physicist. Professor Jeanlot.
Thank you so much, Dr. Duffy and distinguished colleagues. It's been a pleasure working with many of you over the years. Indeed, from a technical point of view, and here I speak as someone who has discussions with technical experts in the United States and also around the world, I have to say, on the one hand, that we feel very frustrated and concerned, but on the other hand, there is also quite a bit of hope. Let me start with the first one. We all know now, especially in hindsight, that no country felt itself adequately prepared for the novel coronavirus, the COVID-19, even though healthcare professionals and public health experts were telling us for years, a pandemic is a real possibility, you should be worried about it. In many ways, those of us who deal with nuclear weapons issues see a parallel. Nuclear weapons, from a technical point of view, present clear and present danger to countries and societies around the world. And it's in that sense that we are somewhat frustrated and concerned that lack of attention makes it so easy to just put it at the back of one's mind that this is not really the most urgent and pressing problem. It isn't right now, but it can become one of the hugely overwhelming problems for the world at large. With that as a background, let me emphasize a hopeful message. It is indeed true that in the end, all of the policy discussions, let alone treaty decisions, have to be made at the political level. We understand that. But the good news is there's a rather rich and extensive technical and military community that is quite committed to maintaining discussions. And we do have discussions quietly behind closed doors between potential adversary nations and also between allies. And it's in those technical and military communities, including some of the panel members that we have present today, that we have the ability to compare notes with each other and to make sure that we at least understand what are some of the trigger points, what are some of the concerns on both sides. By the way, this is to reinforce a point made by just about everyone on this panel, Undersecretary Nakamitsu, Undersecretary Gadamuller, and others. One of the key outcomes of the treaties, for example, the Open Skies Treaty, as well as New START, is that it engages military personnel, inspectors on the ground, working together with each other so that people get to know each other, get to know their capabilities, and even get to know the terminology that they use. And it may seem really dumb, but understanding the concepts and the words that we use has turned out to be one of the chief hurdles in moving forward. So again, on the technical level, we have been working hard to try and define terminology, define concepts. What does deterrence mean, for instance? And it's that deep bench of technical foundation that we have that we would offer in service of the policymakers who can now come in and, as many have emphasized, extend New START or maintain treaties like the Open Skies Treaty that are so helpful to our stability and security around the world.
Thank you very much, Professor Jeanlo. I'd like to direct this question to Governor Brown and Deputy Secretary Gottemoeller. So let's say the U.S. had a strong desire to deal on these issues. You've both worked with the Russians, rose throughout your career, Governor Brown, in exchanges and dialogues that you've had over the years. Do we have an interlocutor, a partner on the other side? What's going on in the Russian political environment? Would they be able to engage with us?
I think Rose is the more experienced, so I'll defer to her first.
All right, I'll take a crack at it and then pass the floor to you, Governor. I have found that actually it's actually been since the Cuban Missile Crisis, way back in the early 1960s, over 50 years ago, when we felt this deep sense of crisis between the USSR at the time and the United States, and in that context began to develop the means and methods and the experts, the people who could work together in the diplomatic setting. And Ray Jeanlo was quite right, bringing military expertise to bear. And now we have not only a deep bench, I would say, of expertise in some ways, but we also have a really strong experiential base with the Russians. And so we actually do speak the same language in many ways at the negotiating table. That doesn't mean by any stretch of the imagination that we have identical interests. And of course, a negotiation is always about battling for your own interests and seeing how you can best serve your own interests in also getting to yes with an opponent who needs to get something out of the negotiations as well. But at the moment, I feel quite confident that we could move on and negotiate a new arms control deal, a nuclear arms control deal that would serve the U.S. national security interests. We do have the capacity and capability to do so, not least because at the moment we do have active inspections going on all the time in the Russian Federation for the New START treaty. So we have inspectors who are experienced, we have weapon system operators who understand how to deal with inspectors. All of these pragmatic tools are out there for us. I do fear if somehow New START goes away and we have no more inspection experience, we have no more opportunities to work with the Russians inside their nuclear facilities and they and our nuclear facilities on verification and monitoring. I do fear in a couple of years that experience base will weaken and fade. And so that is something that we have to think about. We have built up the capacity and capability. It gives us 24/7 eyes on the Russian nuclear arsenal. Is that not in our interest? And it also gives us the tools to negotiate new treaties. Governor Brown.
What about Mr. Putin, though, and his group, his
All right.
colleague?
Well, if I may.
Mr. Putin has said that he's ready to renew this START treaty. So he's not the problem. The problem is here. We should get going, as Rose says.
Governor Brown and
I would say, well, I do want to say something about, I think I can quote this conversation, but I've spoken with Henry Kissinger several times on this very topic. And he has met repeatedly with President Putin, and he believes that if Putin says something, he'll stick to it, and that he's a person you can negotiate with. So that's one person who is not perfect, but has a lot of experience in this particular field. Secondly, speaking from what I understand, politics, Russia has become, like China is also, a whipping boy. So forgetting what the numbers of good and bad points about Putin and Russia, now in the domestic political dialogue, political commercials are being made, speeches are being made, news shows, MSNBC, you can name it. Russia is a good target to get off these domestic problems that are so hard to deal with. So we got to deal with that. And I believe something that it reflects something very, very dangerous, but very true when President Trump said, "What good are nuclear weapons if you don't use them?" And that sheer lack of understanding the nature of the power of nuclear weapons is not just what President Trump is thinking. If people thought about it and knew what the people on this panel know, there'd be a lot more concern. So Putin has whatever you want to say. I've got several books here on Mr. Putin, and you can list all the misdeeds and traits that you don't like. But the fact is, we've worked with Putin in the past. We have worked with him even now, and it's absolutely imperative. And we're not perfect either. Some of our bad points are different than some of Putin's bad points. But whatever the points are, if I can now quote Bill Perry here, you got to separate the variables. And the variable of nuclear blunder is so powerful that we got to focus on that one while we, we can deal with all the other issues. But right now, New START is up, and we got Putin's buy-in. Now we got to get Trump's. It's that simple. And on the weapon systems, what is destabilizing? There's all sorts of things to be talked about. But I can tell you, and I've talked to the many political leaders in Washington, this is not a serious topic. The threat of nuclear blunder is a non-issue in the minds of many, many powerful people in Washington. Not all. So the first job is we got to get the topic taken seriously, and then we've got to push for this 5-year extension. And I don't know. I'm hoping that even if we don't do it this year, we can do it in January of next year. But we have no idea who's going to be president. It's certainly you cannot tell that right now. It's unknowable. So in that sense, we shouldn't wait. We should get the whatever powers to be being brought to bear on the president, on the president's men around him, and whatever other advisors, and also deploying the Senate where we can. Yeah, because and I guess the barrier, and it's not a technical point, it's a human understanding point. Just understanding what the stakes are is the first job. Communicating that, and I believe if we get that over, I think things would follow logically, and New START would be confirmed for another 5 years, and then we can go into these other points that are profoundly important, but don't have to get done this year.
So we have a number of questions coming in from our audience, which I'm, by the way, getting as text messages in case you notice me looking down now and then. There are several about North Korea, and I'm going to pose those to Undersecretary Nakamitsu and Dr. Perry. Questions about Ms. Nakamitsu, how do you assess the current deadlock in U.S.-North Korea talks, especially as related to North Korea's nuclear threat? And then Dr. Perry has a long history of dealing or trying to deal with the North Koreans. So same question, what's the threat from North Korea? How should we proceed?
Obviously, we don't have any direct information sources, but we do very closely monitor situations in DPRK. The signs that we see is not terribly encouraging at the moment. We don't know exactly what's happening with the COVID-19 situation within DPRK, but they seem to be a clear sort of signs coming from DPRK that they wanted to pursue their military development path rather than re-engaging diplomatically to seek solutions. And we had a great hope, we had a serious hope for the bilateral dialogues between the United States and DPRK. And we would definitely like to urge both countries to return to that path. I think overall situation in the region also remains quite difficult. This is a time when, in fact, all countries that have a stake in that DPRK denuclearization interest to come together and return and encourage two countries to return to a diplomatic path. But the signs that we see at the moment are not terribly positive.
Dr. Perry, from your experience, how should we proceed with North Korea?
We should proceed from a realistic view of what the North Koreans can and will do. When we were negotiating with them, when I was negotiating with them 2 decades ago, our goal was to keep them from building a nuclear arsenal. I think we had a probability of succeeding then, but through a failure of imagination, both on the part of the American government and the Korean government, we never were able to push that through. Now they have a nuclear arsenal. And the Trump administration thinks they're going to be able to negotiate with them to get them to give it up. I think that's a fool's errand. They're not going to give it up. What we ought to be negotiating with them on is ways to be sure that it is made, they're not building it up and they're not going to use it. I think they have no real motivation to use that nuclear arsenal. They're using it. They want it for deterrence purposes. But we ought to be sure of that. And so we change, but as long as our negotiation goal is as it's now stated to be, to get them to give up a nuclear arsenal, I believe we will not succeed. So the first step is to get a more realistic goal and then to get back to negotiating again. And the goal is to make that nuclear arsenal safer from our point of view, from the world's point of view.
Let's go back to this question of political will in the US. Someone has the question, how can we raise more public awareness about this issue that leads to people asking their elected officials to take action? Anyone, please.
Have an interesting program at the Commonwealth Club. And I think you record things, and how many people look at these things typically?
It can be from hundreds to hundreds of thousands.
Right.
And in these days, when the club is offering programs only online, the viewership is very high, very high.
Well, my point is you've got to keep the flame burning. Keep working on these things.
Yeah, I would like to emphasize the importance of bringing younger people into this issue. And these days at the United Nations in disarmament and international security field, we don't have a lot of encouraging discussions. But one thing that was very encouraging last year's first committee, which is the General Assembly's Committee on Disarmament and International Security, was the adoption for the first time of a resolution giving us the mandate to work with younger people. Empowering them, more education and training opportunities, networking opportunities, etc. So we now are really trying to heavily invest in creating the younger people's networks and capacities to start thinking about it, learning from each other, and networking. And as a result, they will be able to reach more effectively to their political leaders. And I'm beginning to see some interesting results. When the NPT RevCon review conference was postponed, there are younger people's organizations that are taking initiatives and organizing online Zoom conferences, as an input into the future NPT review conference. So we need to do more of those things. I would like very much to have Greta Thunberg of nuclear disarmament amongst the younger people.
Dr. Perry, tell us about the William Perry Project, because you've been working with younger people.
The William Perry Project has a goal of educating people about nuclear dangers, particularly educating young people. And since we decided we wanted to educate young people, we thought we ought to have some young people on our project. So indeed, my granddaughter, Lisa Perry, who's just 30, is playing a major role in that project. In particular, she was the project leader on putting together a blog, which will be released next month, on nuclear dangers and nuclear issues. So and I have her represent me and to go in my place in many things that I've been doing myself. So if we want to get young people interested, we ought to bring young people into discussions. We ought to get them involved in doing things. I find out that they are very quick at understanding these issues once we explain it to them. They just don't ever hear about them ordinarily. But that's not because they're not capable of understanding. And when they do understand, they're willing to act on it. So I think I would completely agree with the Undersecretary General's comments about the importance of bringing young people into this issue. We all ought to work on that because they're the ones going to have to. We have failed to solve this problem. We left it in their laps. They're going to have to solve it, so we better get them educated.
So you've done some of the younger people. I think Stanford students have made some videos and used social media in some very interesting ways to try to educate their fellow young people, students, about nuclear issues.
One of the things the young people do about it is they use the kind of media that they're used to using. And so they bring in a different way of, I think of educating people as giving lectures and writing books and writing papers. They use social media to educate. And that's I think what's needed to get the young people on board. We have to speak to them in their own language, really.
So yes, Rose.
I just wanted to endorse what our previous two speakers had to say, but also to say you would find some unexpected pockets around the country where young people are becoming involved. For example, when I was working on issues related to our ratification process for the comprehensive test ban about 5 years ago, I went to Mississippi, to Oxford, Mississippi, to the university there, Ole Miss, and I met with a group of students who had produced a documentary film about the nuclear tests that had occurred in Mississippi, which many people do not remember at all. There were some particular salt domes down there, some salt mines that were used for some particular nuclear tests. And the students had gone back and found people who had been affected, whose property had been affected, and made a documentary that was fascinating. And yet, at that time, they were having trouble getting the word out. I do find that that is a problem, getting the word out. And I'm hopeful, as both Bill and Izumi said, that now in the age of more attention to using social media, number one, but also in doing work remotely through Zoom and other video conferencing, that we can accelerate getting the word out on these issues, because I know there are pockets of interest and concern around the country. The Downwinders in Utah, that's another place I found a lot of interest among the students at Brigham Young University in Utah, because many of them had grandparents who had been affected by being downwind of the nuclear tests in Nevada. And they were very, very strong family memories that they really drew on. So I think if we can pull people out, there is concern and interest around the country.
Governor Brown, I'm aware of your activities working directly with the Russians, sort of based on historic preservation, your Fort Ross project. Could you say a little bit about that? Because you managed to get a dialogue going with the Russians in a pretty unique way.
Yeah, the Fort Ross dialogue started, I didn't initiate it, but it revolves around the Fort Ross Park and the conservancy there, and the fact that this was the Russian presence in America in 1814 to about 1841, and there are Russian sailors buried there, and that cemetery has been restored. The Russian ambassador, both to the UN and to the United States, came to the ceremony 2 years ago. There was a Russian patriarch who blessed the proceedings. So it is a point of convergence where the Americans and the Russians historically were present and were intermarried with some of the indigenous people. So it's a very good lesson that we can learn from the past. Going forward, I do want to make a point that our Fort Ross dialogue, we did have Dr. Perry there, we had the Russian ambassador Antonov, and the New York Times had a little story where they talked about, oh, there's some Russian money that supports some of the Fort Ross dialogue. Well, that's true, but there's also American money. But the point being that Russia has become such a salacious topic for even papers like the New York Times, that it becomes very difficult to have a serious topic. That so many of these other things, whether it's hacking emails or whatever the Russians are doing, some terrible breaking international law and all the rest, but the idea of having a dialogue about these fundamental issues is so obvious, but yet beyond the comprehension of what you would otherwise think as very thoughtful people. And I do want to say that our national media, and I will name them, Washington Post, New York Times, MSNBC, they have lots of stories. I'm not going to even judge the merits, but they don't give much attention, if any, to the nuclear danger. And they have people who've been around a long time. They act like they know everything. But I would say what we're talking about is removed and from the mainstream. So that's why I think the Fort Ross dialogue is important. But even to be part of it is to risk vilification. And I know that. I had a personal conversation about this one reporter, and we went back and forth for 20 minutes, 25 minutes on him talking about the Russians. Why do we talk to them, and do we denounce them for Syria, Crimea, killing former Russian spies and all the rest? And I kept saying, we're talking about nuclear danger and a dialogue to make the world safer on that score. And that was an argument. I never won the argument, but I did make it. And I can tell you, this takes courage, it takes persistence, and it takes getting allies in high places. But we are at the point where it reminds me in my early Catholic childhood that it was a sin, a venial sin to go into a Protestant church. And even for my sister to be a bridesmaid or a maid of honor in a Protestant wedding was not allowed. So we're kind of at that point now with Russia. You can't talk to them. You can't say anything that's not negative, and that's very counterproductive. So I think we got to get back to the basics. And the basics are that nuclear weapons can cause millions, hundreds of millions of deaths, billions. So that's number one. And number two, let's deal with it. I mean, I keep thinking that, Roosevelt and Churchill especially didn't like Stalin. But when it came to Nazi Germany, that was a bigger evil. Well, if we have a nuclear blunder and 10 or 20 or 50 million people die, that would be worse, be greater in magnitude than Nazi Germany. So there's plenty of reason, without having to go any further, it's a big danger. Russia, it has to be part of the partnership here. But that idea is deviant to the mainstream media, mainstream culture. So we got our work cut out for us, young people, and we got a lot of work with the old people because their minds are very confused at this point and need to be unconfused by whomever we can mobilize. So that's what I'm interested in the dialogue and talking to my Democratic friends, who in many ways sound like well, they're not even Republicans. It's very similar to what it was in the old days when people would say you're a little pink or you're a fellow traveler. That's kind of what you are now. Being in dialogue is to be a little pink, using an old term from the 50s. So we got our work cut out for us in just making room, making space for frank discussion with the Russians. And the same thing is becoming true with China. We're not going to be able to talk to them pretty soon either. So America is getting to the point where talk is evil if the one you're talking to is on this list of our main adversaries.
So we're getting to the point where we need to wrap up, but among this group of senior statespeople, we have a super senior statesperson, and I'm going to give him the last word. Secretary Shultz, we are so honored and pleased that at your stage in life, you're able to provide leadership in this area. And again, you are our most senior statesman. Tell us what thoughts you have to leave with everyone here.
Well, I'm in my 100th year, but I feel like a young man. So here's the thing I think we should focus on. Get somebody who Mr. Trump likes and trusts, and persuade that person that he would score a big point electorally if he invited Rose Godmiller to the White House and deputized her to handle the New START program for her and get it renewed and up and running.
That sounds like a good top of the to-do list. So I would like to give a huge thank you to our panel, former Secretary of State George Shultz, former Secretary of Defense William Perry, former NATO Deputy Secretary General Rose Gottemoeller, United Nations Undersecretary of Disarmament Izumi Nakamitsu, and Governor Jerry Brown. Also, a big thanks to you, Professor Raymond Jeanlot, for being with us. And of course, to the Cooley Law Firm and its CEO, Frederick Barron, who have generously underwritten this program. We are so grateful for their support and hope others will follow their example to support the club during these uncertain times. In addition to thanking our fabulous panel, thank you to all of our viewers online. The club will continue to provide online program in the days ahead. In fact, we're doing so on almost a daily basis. So please visit us regularly at commonwealthclub.org. I'm Gloria Duffy. And now this virtual program of the Commonwealth Club on probably the most important topic of our time is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job.